Assalamu alaikum, dear friends, respected viewers. The topic of the war last week caught the attention of more people than in the previous period. The reason was yet another drone attack, and this time it happened in Adygea. A residential area in the village of Novaya Adygea was damaged. According to official reports, civilians were injured as a result of the attack. 14 people were hospitalized with varying degrees of severity. In addition, during the clearing of the rubble, fragments of a deceased person's body were found. The authorities in Republican media describe what happened as the result of a UAV attack. It is reported that restoration work is underway in residential buildings, assistance is being provided to the victims, and there is also a readiness to partially compensate the material losses of dozens of people whose cars were destroyed by fire. It should be noted that Adygea and the Krasnodar region are regularly mentioned in reports about drone attacks. Previously, it was officially reported that strikes targeted military and infrastructure facilities, including the area of Kanskaya airfield in Adygea, as well as port and port-adjacent infrastructure in the Krasnodar region. In other words, in these cases, the targets were specifically military, not residential areas. That is why what happened in Novaya Adygea caused such a strong reaction, including within the diaspora. A number of organizations publicly expressed their support for those affected. Some sent appeals addressed to the head of the region. In particular, such statements were made by the newly established Circassian organization in Syria, as well as representatives of the Circassian community of Kfar Kama in Israel. At the same time, the circumstances of what happened were actively discussed in the public sphere. While official media mostly stuck to identical wording about a hostile drone attack, independent commentators conducted detailed analyses of video footage and other sources. Many of them agreed that the nature of the damage and traces could correspond to the work of an air defense system, in particular the fall of an anti-aircraft munition or its fragments while repelling the attack. What's also important here is that this version was voiced not only by external observers and experts, but also by Russian military bloggers and authors from the so-called Z segment, albeit in cautious terms, like during the repelling of the attack or possible missile deviation. However, these assessments quickly faded into the background, and official sources focused on dealing with the aftermath.
The missile just flew right past my face. Allahu Akbar. It hit the residential buildings. There's the trail right above my head. Something hit. All my windows blew out with the glass. Something hit, basically. They
are starting to get up now. It just blew everything up over there. Everything here and the cars, everything is smashed everywhere. It should be said that for people who have been following the course of this nearly 4-year war, reports of civilian casualties have, unfortunately, become routine. Just in the past few days, there have been reports of dozens killed in different cities across Ukraine, including women and children. This is yet another reason to once again state the position that was voiced in the very first days. This war must be stopped, and the sooner it happens, the more lives can be saved. Unfortunately, we cannot directly influence this process. All we can do is watch the ongoing intensive negotiation process, hoping that the countries will eventually be able to reach an agreement. However, not everyone shares this point of view. There are also other approaches present in the media space, including on platforms that use the name of the Adygea people of Krasnodar Krai. In one of the recent video materials, the main character, who presents himself as a volunteer, expresses regret that the Adygea people are not massively involved in the war. He talks about the need to develop a willingness to serve in law enforcement agencies and to be ready for self-sacrifice for the sake of certain goals.
Сигхо на самом деле, чтобы хоть бы, потому что, напомню, что хочешь ты нахуй, зами, полициями, цехаркон нахуй, для жены нахуй, цехом дади человек, напомню, что воспринимать я, да, именно полиция, да, полиция джама уже, это значит, себя бегать, отгадывать, что-то плохое, хаубиджа, харш мутау,
This feat transforms a simple exclamation into a monumental display of human endurance. The air vibrates with the force of the note, which carries on with unwavering strength until it finally reaches its natural conclusion. Just like being able to make your own judgment about it. Quite regardless of all the technical details, when innocent civilians suffer, it remains absolutely essential to demonstrate heartfelt solidarity and support with those affected, and to speak out clearly and courageously about the root causes of their suffering, without ever replacing compassion with mere propaganda. I want to touch on another topic that has come up in recent days, including in private messages. This is the question about the new platform of the Russian anti-war opposition at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which now includes 15 people. First and foremost, it's important to correctly understand the status and boundaries of this structure. We're not talking about a representative body or a platform with a mandate. It does not have the authority to speak on behalf of any peoples or communities. Essentially, this is a consultative platform at pace, formed from specific individuals who primarily represent their own political positions and the organizations through which they became members of it. In essence, this is the first institutionalized format for interaction between anti-war Russians and European structures. Some participants emphasize that they primarily see the platform as a tool for human rights advocacy, considering, for example, that many people who left since the start of the war are facing serious difficulties, including due to the EU's increasingly strict policies toward holders of Russian passports. At the same time, it's also clear that this platform will serve as a way to articulate a political voice. According to reports, the nomination procedure was open. Anyone could apply. However, the final lineup is approved by a decision of the PACE president. So formally, the opportunity to participate was broad, but the final selection was centralized. Particular attention should also be paid to the fact that the resolution establishing this platform included a requirement for a quota for representatives of Russia's indigenous peoples. It is reported that the Ukrainian delegation insisted on the necessity of such a quota. Whether any Circassian political activists were nominated to this platform, I do not know. Among the 15 selected members of the platform, there is a representative from the North Caucasus, Chechen political scientist Ruslan Kutayev. To a Circassian audience, he is known not just for his provocative statements, but for a pattern of public speeches that sometimes echoed imperial narratives. Regarding the Circassians, this includes a reluctance to recognize the Adygea as a single people. It's important to state this directly here, because this isn't just a matter of differing opinions. It's about a person who many in the Circassian community see as one of the consistent opponents of the Circassian political idea. These episodes are available in open sources, and anyone interested can look them up.
Aside from the fact that you have beautiful purebred horses and that Maria Temrikovna was the wife of Ivan the Terrible, you have no other arguments. You do nothing about it.
At the same time, it should be noted and said that, of course, it's important to consider that as people gain new experiences and achieve certain results, they often reconsider their views. The very fact of appearing at the PACE platform for Ruslan Kutayev is undoubtedly an achievement. So we will also be watching with interest to see how this new experience will be reflected in his public statements. Obviously, it is inappropriate to talk about presenting the Circassian issue on this platform. In this sense, the platform does not generate much interest. But at the same time, we cannot ignore the other side of the issue. Hundreds of Circassians who have left their homeland. In recent years, they have remained holders of Russian passports and face difficulties, including legalization and legal status outside their homeland. From this perspective, monitoring such human rights protection mechanisms will, of course, remain a focus of our attention. In addition, the resolution establishing this platform includes a provision on the advisability of creating, in the future, a separate forum for the indigenous peoples of modern Russia. It is known that work in this direction is already being carried out by various groups and organizations, including voices calling for possible representation of the Circassian issue. Therefore, as before, our focus will not be on names and structures, but on the substance of this representation. Who and how? And with what agenda will they speak about Circassian issues on international platforms? And if necessary, of course, we will not only take note of, but also respond to the ongoing process. Today, we continue to cover the recent conference on the Circassian issue, which took place in the Lithuanian parliament. Together with you, we are gradually getting acquainted with the content of the participant speeches. In the previous episode, we watched translations of the speeches given by guests of the event, representatives of other peoples. And before moving on to the speeches of the conference organizers, including Lithuanian politicians and experts, as well as representatives of Circassian political activism, and only after that will it be possible to make some generalizations and conclusions, today I would like to specifically present the speeches of representatives from the academic community among the Circassian diaspora. Hussein Oli Pinar, Doctor of Science, researcher at the University of Alberta and the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. In his work, he studies Russian imperial expansion, colonial violence, and memory politics, examining the Circassian genocide in the context of broader colonial processes in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus. And also, for your attention, a presentation by Nurgin Koch, professor of history at Karabukh University, an expert on the history of Russian imperial policy in the Caucasus. In her research, she consistently interprets the conquest of Circassia as a systematic imperial policy of deportation and ethnic cleansing, the consequences of which continue to have an impact to this day. I would like to conclude my participation in this episode with a brief clarification regarding one of the responses on the channel. The author of the comment, referring to statements made by a certain public figure, not even on our platform, tried to attribute to me support for the position voiced there. Without delving into the details of what exactly was discussed, I want to remind attentive viewers, even the statements made by guests on our channel during broadcasts do not always reflect my personal point of view. And there's nothing unusual about that. Platforms like this exist for discussing and recording different viewpoints, not for automatically endorsing them. So if you want to understand my stance on a particular issue, the simplest and most appropriate way is to ask me directly. In the comments, on our social media, or on the Circassian Media Telegram channel. On this note, I say goodbye to you. The issue continues with translations of speeches by representatives of the scientific community from the Circassian diaspora, but we are not going to remain silent, and we will speak the truth. Assalamu alaikum.
I would like to start with a simple but important point. What we are living through in global politics now is not just another crisis, not just another phase in an already familiar conflict. We are entering a different period altogether. I think this is one of the issues I want to underline. The international system that emerged after the Cold War, based on expectations of gradual liberalization, the decline of empires and stable state sovereignty, is no longer working in the way many of us expected. Periods like this mark transitions between international orders. Domination has always been present in international relations. What is rare are the moments when domination is reorganized, openly reorganized, and presented as a legitimate foundation of international order. And when this happens, the consequences last for decades. And this change and the period where we are now matter enormously for small states and the peoples living under imperial rule. And talking about imperial rule, the domination of others, Lithuania knows this from experience as historical reality. Lithuanian independence did not come about because the Soviet imperial center suddenly reformed itself morally or politically. Late Soviet reforms did not dismantle the imperial system. What they did was weaken it, expose its internal contradictions, and make it vulnerable to pressure from its peripheries. This is a rather broader historical pattern. Empires do not dissolve because political leaders in the capital of an empire adopt more progressive views. Empires dissolve when pressure builds at the edges of an empire, and the system can no longer function as an integrated whole. In other words, imperial collapse begins at the periphery, regions like Caucasia, not at the imperial center. And this, I say, is an historical observation. This perspective is important, I want to underline. When we think of Russia today, much of public discussion focuses on the Russian leadership, as if it is a determiner of if Russia will cease to be an empire or not in the case of leadership change. That focus is understandable. People are thinking and talking about the leadership change and if it will produce a result. But this does not adequately explain how power actually operates. Russia should be understood not simply as an authoritarian state, but as an imperial system that never truly disappeared. That the Russian imperial system is held together through familiar mechanisms, and we observe this through time in different regions of Russia, imperial Russia. Economic extraction from subordinated regions, demographic and political control, tight controls over how history is officially interpreted and thought. When leadership changes inside such a system, the imperial structures remain intact. The outcome is usually continuity, not transformation. This is why hopes for simple reset after a change of leadership have repeatedly proven unrealistic, and it will prove to be so in the future as things remain as it is now. The issue is not only who governs in Russia, but what kind of political structure dominates and continues to be reproduced in Russia, inside of Russia. This also helps us to understand the limits of what is called often containment. One of the concepts used in our everyday life is containing the imperial desires of Russia. The argument out there is we have to take measures to stop Russia, contain its imperial desires. I argue containment can reduce immediate danger, but if it leaves imperial structures intact, it does not solve the underlying problem. On the other hand, some favor frozen conflicts. For example, to freeze the war in Ukraine, which are sometimes presented as pragmatic compromises. However, this method rarely frees imperial ambitions. More often, it allows time for military rebuilding and rewriting of narratives. From a historical perspective, stabilizing, normalizing an empire without dismantling its capacity to dominate others does not produce peace. It produces a delay, and delayed conflicts tend to return into more dangerous forms. At this point, it becomes necessary to talk seriously about de-imperialization, another concept we keep hearing in discussions about contemporary global politics and in relation to Russia. Here, I want to bring something solid on the table to discuss around it. The German case, the Nazi German case, I think is a historical example of how imperial system was structurally dismantled. In Germany's case, de-imperialization involved several concrete changes. First, territorial revisionism was made impossible. Borders were fixed and enforced. The idea of returning to formal imperial space lost political credibility. Second, there was a real rupture in institutions and elites. Imperial and militarized structures were dismantled, and new security doctrines were built under strict constraints. Third, imperial narratives collapsed. Defeat could no longer be presented as historic sacrifice or historical injustice. Expansion became associated with catastrophe, not honor. Finally, Germany's security and prosperity became tied to participation in non-imperial international order. Empire stopped being functional because it is no longer worked. This is an important point. Germany was not de-imperialized because Germans suddenly became better people, and it is the same with Russia. It was de-imperialized, the Germany, because the imperial reproduction system itself was dismantled. If we look at Russia after 1991 through this lens, the contrast is clear. The empire went through temporary reduction of territory that was widely treated as reversible. It's a clear contrast to the German case. Territorial losses were seen as temporary. Imperial elites in Russia largely remained in place. Imperial narratives were reworked rather than abandoned, and no durable post-imperial security framework was established. I want to emphasize that this was not only an internal matter, it was also external matter. So there is an external responsibility why Russia remained in such a character after 1991. Under these conditions, it should not be a surprise to us that the imperial behavior of Russia re-emerged. Structures that are not dismantled tend to regenerate. This is where the role of captive nations becomes central. Unlike post-war Germany, Russia still contains many subordinated nations within its borders: Circassians, Chechens, Tatars, Bashkirs, and many others are often discussed as minorities. I want to criticize that use as well here. From a historical and structural point of view, talking about them, these nations, as minorities is a misleading concept. They are better understood as colonized or subordinated political communities. They are not important not only as victims of Russian imperial violence, who deserve recognition, but also political communities whose actions influence how empire is maintained and or resisted. Crucially, their influence are sustained through conscious historical agency, through the preservation of memory, the refusal of assimilation, and maintenance of political claims across generations. They challenge the idea that there is only one legitimate historical voice. They expose inequalities that imperial narratives try to hide. If external occupation of Russia is not an option, like in the case of Nazi Germany, or there is no visible possibility to impose external dismantlement of the Russian Empire, the captive nations perform inside the imperial system a role similar to the external constraints that existed in Germany. Thanks to them, imperial stability the rulers of Russia seek is harder to maintain. Among these cases, the Circassians are particularly significant. Their history presents a form of imperial violence that cannot easily be explained away. The destruction and deportation of Circassian population in the 19th century meet what we today define as genocide. Equally important is the fact that Circassian historical memory survived largely outside imperial control through large diaspora. This makes denial difficult and narrative control incomplete. Recognition of Circassian history undermines the idea that Russian expansion in Caucasus was benign and inevitable. It also opens space for other subordinated nations to articulate their own histories. Circassians and other Caucasian nations that resist destabilize Russia by making silence and denial of imperial crimes unsustainable. From an analytical perspective, engagement with captive nations follows directly from an understanding of how imperial systems reproduce. Parliamentary recognition, dialogue with representatives of subordinated nations, and sustained attention to historical truth shape the broader legal and political environment in which imperial domination is either normalized or constrained in Europe. International legal scholarship, I want to underline, and it applies to many of the cases in relation to Russia, has long recognized that occupation is not considered legally complete when resistance continues. Even when annexation is declared, administrative integration is enforced, and decades pass. In this case, and in this sense, recognition of Circassian genocide contributes to maintaining the legal and historical non-finality of imperial domination. It affirms that dispossession and incorporation do not automatically mature into legitimacy, and that claims to self-determination remain analytically and normatively present as long as domination is contested. Seen in the slide, the question of Circassia's future is about understanding how incomplete imperial incorporation continues to structure political possibility of future independence. The political agency that can assure Circassian independence, whether expressed through institutional continuity, diasporic organization, or claims preserved in international forums, remains historically valid. Lithuanians' own history gives it a particular sensitivity to these dynamics because Lithuanians themselves have lived through similar processes themselves. I would like to conclude with a final message here. Empires survive when their foundations are left unexamined and uncontested, including unresolved imperial incorporation, the continued subordination of colonized peoples, extractive relations between the center and the periphery, and security institutions built for coercion rather than accountability. History suggests that postponing these structural problems only raises the eventual cost in lives, in security, in political stability. The present moment does not lead to a single inevitable outcome. Instead, it presents several possible ways in which power can be organized. Some allow empire to survive by adapting to new circumstances. Others weaken its ability to sustain imperial power over time. Only in this case do previously suppressed political futures, including those of nations such as Circassians, remain open. And the outcome emerges depends not only on military developments, but also on legal recognition, historical truth, political choices made beyond the imperial center. And now Vilnius is one of these places where those critical choices will be made. Thank you very much.
Gentlemen, we have Professor Dr. Norgun Kush.
It's an honor for me to be present in the Semias Parliament of the Republic of Lithuania as a resistant, sublime Caucasus and Circassians who were plundered, tortured, massacred, and forcibly displaced by Russia's official state policy exactly 161 years ago, simply because they loved and defended their homeland. Adygea wrote a Circassian song say that we are leaving our homeland, but it will never leave our hearts. After the Ottoman Empire's defeat on the eastern front of the Crimean War, eliminated its threat to Russia, the Russians turned their full force to Caucasus. They launched their final attack on Imam Shamil, forcing him to surrender on August 25, 1859. After defeating the depleted Chechen and Dagestani tribes, they turned westward to Circassia and defeated them as well. Muhammad Emin, who continued his struggle against the Russians in Circassia, surrendered after Sheikh Shamil. When the Russians gained complete control of Caucasus in May 1864, they resorted to deportations far more barbaric than those they had committed in Crimea. The Circassians achieved great success against the Russians, and countless Circassians fought heroically to defend their homeland. For example, I would like to mention one of these heroes, Tevciko Kızbey, Hacı Kızbey, known as the Circassian Lion. In the Battle of Eben in 1834, Kızbey, commanding 700 Circassian cavalry, completely defeated a 14,000 Russian army. Despite the superhuman efforts of brave and daring warriors like Kızbey, the Russians' occupation of the Caucasus was broad, depending on multifaceted development. For example, the great powers of the time, especially England and France, didn't show the necessary interest in the occupation of the Caucasus. The Ottoman Empire's misguided and inadequate steps, from time to time, conflicts between tribes, etc. Facing unexpected resistance in Caucasus, famous Russian General Yermolov acted on the principle to conquer the Caucasus, destroy everything that lives. Killing a Caucasus child is saving the lives of hundreds of Russians. Unfortunately, history repeats itself. Count Leo Tolstoy, who participated in the Crimean War, witnessed the massacre in the Caucasus and was horrified by what he witnessed. Tolstoy described the Russian capture of Muslim villages of these words. It was customary to raid villages at night because the women and children captured at that hour had no time to escape from surprise. So terrible were the actions of the Russian soldiers, who stormed the homes, groups of 2 or 3, under the cover of darkness, that no official war clerk could find the straight to record them. Berge, who justified the Russian government's military colonial occupation, writes that, "I will never forget what I saw the Novorossky Bay, where 17,000 mountaineers had gathered. Whether Christian, Muslim, or atheist, anyone who saw their situation would undoubtedly be devastated. The Russians treat the Circassian inmates they wouldn't even to the animals." How can I write these events without tears? General Katarchev, the Russian consul in Trabzon, who implemented the deportation decision, informed the authorities. 70,000 Circassians arrived in Batumi on their way to Turkey, of the 24,000 people who were taken to Trabzon. 19,000 have died so far. I have also heard that 40 and 60 people a day are dying of the 4,000 people taken to Trabzon, Varna, and Istanbul. I think the number can give an idea about the high death rates. Russian officer Drozdov described the incredible scenes he witnessed. The horrific sign of the roads was this: the corpses of children, women, and the elderly torn apart by dogs. The exiles, weakened by hunger and disease, were unable to walk from exhaustion and were eaten alive by dogs. The living and healthy ones had no time for that. Captains paid by the head packed their boats with Circassians like cargo and threw overboard to those with the slight signs of illness. Russian historian Zaharian openly confessed the crime of genocide they commit. Say that the Circassians do not love us. We drove them from their free pastures. We destroyed their villages. Many tribes were completely wiped out. Some leading scholars argue that the Circassian genocide is the least remembered genocide in the history world. A look at Circassian history reveals that the systematic killing, irreversible displacement, destructions of animals and forests, torture, and the destruction of cultural identity and languages carried out by Russians during this period definitely and clearly demonstrate that the Russians committed genocide against the Circassians. Convention on the Prevention of and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted by the United Nations, entered into force on January 12, 1951. Since the convention doesn't impose any time limitation on determining the crime of genocide, crimes committed in the past are clearly within the scope of convention. Eyewitness testimonies, written documents, and countless pieces of evidence demonstrate the necessity of assessing Tsarist Russia's situation within the scope of the crime of genocide, as defined in the Roma Statute of the International Criminal Court. Just as the Circassian comma emerged from the bottom of the Black Sea, a witness to the profound trauma experienced by the old people of North Caucasus, so too must the Russians confront the Circassian genocide. Thus, they can make a hopeful contribution to both regional and world peace. To sum up, attempts to promote the genocide are nothing more than an attempt to protect the existence and spirit of Caucasians and Circassians. I express my eternal gratitude to the honorable nation of Lithuania and its noble parliament, Seimas, for supporting Circassian people in this endeavor. Labai ačiū.
Thank you very much.
ويتاب خزمي كبزر ويبسم خغش ساعة الوش زقوة وتكون يحب شرشاق وابنو خجوجات